Hi, everybody. We're going to get started in just a minute. Hi, everyone. I know how great it is to catch up with everyone, but we do want to promise to get you all on your way by 1:45, so we need to get started, and we have a phenomenal program in front of us, so thank you for your attention. Thank you for being here today. I guess what this shows in part is that if you have a nice air-conditioned room on a hot summer day, you can really get a big crowd. But thank you for being here. I feel like we got some free publicity this weekend. Any of you saw the British Open, which I remember from my days at IMG, I'm supposed to call the Open Championships. But saw the background often in the picture of the wind farms in Great Britain, which I thought was phenomenal publicity for what's happening there as well as for today. So what I do want to do is just spend 1 minute really both welcoming you and thank you for participating in Our Energy Policies event and in our community. We now are past 10 years in organization and increasingly finding that the need to bring people together both for educational sessions as well as for working sessions is only growing. And so thank you for your support. I particularly want to thank all of our partners and supporters, which really span the energy space, which is something we're very proud of, from banking to law, from clean energy to oil and gas, advocacy groups, trade associations, and that's really what we pride ourselves on, which is the ability to bring people together who can provide all the different perspectives needed to solve the kinds of challenging issues that we face in our work on energy issues. And in that respect, you may have seen out front sort of a little placard about the Our Energy Library. One of our programs, which I really encourage all of you to use and to encourage colleagues to use, is really the most comprehensive online repository of papers, reports, studies, articles, and so forth on energy issues, which is well curated, well indexed, and a very important part of our work in addition to the live events, webinars, and other things that we do. I also want to acknowledge our exceptional board, 5 members of whom are here today: Jay Warrenklein, Stephen Birkenfeld, Francis Rashevsky, Sarah Fitz, and last but definitely not least, Bob Cattell, who, as the chair of the National Offshore Wind Energy Consortium, really is in large part the inspiration for our event today. So thanks to all of you in that respect. And finally, particular thanks to our co-hosts today, Ørsted and Morgan Lewis. You'll be hearing from representatives of those organizations shortly, but our gratitude to them for co-hosting today's event. The last thing I'll say before bringing everyone up is to note your questions, because as we always do at the end of the conversation, we will open the floor to your questions, and we look forward to hearing what's on your mind. So thank you again for being here. I'd now like to ask our speakers to join me up here on the podium, and we will get started. Thanks. Thanks. And as they're coming up, I'm going to introduce Jim Tynan of Morgan Lewis, one of the foremost attorneys in the clean energy field, transactions, financings, investment, tax issues, has been involved in offshore wind for 20 plus years, truly one of the experts. He is going to kick things off and then turn it over to the panel. Jim?
Good afternoon, everybody. Let's see how we can get going here. So thanks so much for being here. As Bill said, I'm Jim Tynan, partner at Morgan Lewis, one of the law firms very active in the energy sector. The Morgan Lewis project finance team covers a lot of energy regulatory stuff, as well as corporate investment, project finance, and tax. And as Bill said, I've been working full-time in the renewable energy space for over 25 years and have been actually active, it's not kidding, in offshore wind for over 20 years, starting with some of the initial efforts out in Long Island with LIPA, trying to get a wind farm going off Jones Beach, and some of the original investors in Cape Wind, as well as some of the other early stage developments around the country. And right now we're very happy and active, and we're representing a lot of the largest developers around the country in the offshore wind space, including one of the founding partners here for OEP, the BP partnership with Equinor on the Empire projects in New York, including helping out with the Sunset Park, South Brooklyn terminal, and all of the other contracts in New York. So that's Morgan Lewis. I want to cover two other things to kind of set the stage for the conversation here. Is where we are, where we've been. It's been, we are pretty much in sort of the third stage, I call it, of the offshore wind development in the United States. There were those early days with the pioneers such as Jim Gordon at Cape Wind. And then starting in 2009, 2010, BOEM began issuing leases in the federal waters. Now, 13 years later, there are 27 active leases that are in play around the United States. And you can see the issuance of the leases on the BOEM website, but that of those 27, 13 of them were just issued in the last 18 months. So with all of that growth, there's been that was sort of in the second stage, and now we're seeing some of those projects that got leases 6-7 years ago, and then offtake agreements 3 or 4 years ago, are about to hit the waters. So we'll hear more about that today. There are 2 projects today in active construction, and from where we look at Morgan Lewis, we think there'll be 4 or 5 large projects that will go into construction in the next 6 months, and over the next 2 or 3 years, we may get 4 more projects each year. The goal, of course, is to try to get to 30,000 megawatts in the next 7 years. That'll be a great challenge. It expects to generate $50 to $60 billion of investment. A brand new industry that didn't exist 10 years ago is now happening. And so it's very, very exciting. What we're seeing, the last push in these last 2 or 3 years, are evidenced by some amazing tailwinds, so to speak. And this is where, over the last several years, we're starting to see a confluence of federal policy, and with Amanda here, with her leadership at BOEM, helping us with a lot of leases in the last couple of years, and 3 very active auctions, that we're starting to see federal policy encouraging the leases and development and permitting. We're starting to see state policies up and down the Atlantic seaboard with procurement, interconnection. A lot of politics is now at the state and local level are pushing for the offshore wind. We now have some of the best experienced, deep-pocketed developers coming from Europe to help build these projects. And we're also seeing amazing help with the capital markets and tax policy to help promote renewable energy investments, including the Inflation Reduction Act from just last summer. So all of these things are great headwinds, but what you're starting to, there's been a lot of news just in the last week. It's been offshore wind has also some headwinds that we have to deal with, and these are challenges that we have to work through together. So right now, after the increase in development and R&D, how costs and prices for 10 years were going down, for the very first time in the history of renewable energy, construction costs are going up, supply chain issues, congestion, and the increase in technology and trying to have the manufacturing base keep up with that is a challenge. We'll talk about, the panel will talk about inflation, the costs coming up contracts at the state level were issued 3 or 4 years ago, and virtually every single one of them are underwater. Some are being canceled, Massachusetts, and by the developers. Some are being canceled by the states in Rhode Island. Some states are trying to renegotiate to keep the projects alive. This is a challenge for us. And the other thing that's a major challenge is the fact that this industry, there are no workers today to service what we expect in the next 4 or 5 years. Over the last 4 or 5 years, industry, labor, manufacturing have really stepped up to try to create jobs and training and education opportunities all across the country. So I'm excited to be here. I think what I'm hoping the panel will do here is help us through these headwinds and teach us how we're going to do this. So what I want to do is just introduce Lyndie Hice-Dunton, who is going to be the moderator today. Lyndie is the Executive Director of the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium. And with that consortium based here in New York, they are working with the federal government and state agencies to do R&D for the technologies, not just for the wind turbines, but for the whole value chain that's going to come into this market that just didn't exist 5 years ago. So with that, I just want to turn it over to Lyndie, and she can introduce the rest of the panel. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. And before I start, I wanted to just briefly thank Bill and Jordan and the Our Energy Policy team for the opportunity for all of us to speak today and for inviting me to moderate, and to Bob Cattell, our board chair, for connecting me to this great group. I really appreciate it. So I'm just going to very briefly introduce my esteemed panel, and then we're going to jump into some questions, which I think is what you're all here for. And of course, I lost my file as I was trying to do that. Oh, one moment. Okay, so immediately to my left, although all these panels need no introduction, is David Hardy. So David Hardy is the Executive Vice President and CEO of the Americas region for Ørsted, and he oversees the integrated clean energy solutions in offshore wind, land-based wind, solar projects, solar storage, green fuels, and other initiatives across their green energy transition. So David's been with Ørsted since about 2020 and has been in this role that he's in now since about 2022. And as you all know, Ørsted is one of the biggest offshore wind developers engaged in the US market. Seated next to David is Andrew Kimball. Andrew is the president and CEO of the New York City Economic Development Corporation, where he leads EDC's work on innovation and inclusive economy for all New Yorkers. Andrew has a great history of working in New York and the city, so he also served as the CEO of Industry City, as well as the president and CEO of the Brooklyn Navy Yard Development Corporation. And seated next to Andrew is Amanda Lefton. Amanda, as many of you know, is the former director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which oversees the kind of federal side of offshore wind and the leasing and construction process. So she spearheaded the development and implementation of the Biden administration's ambitious offshore wind agenda, including all federal offshore wind leasing, project reviews, and policy and regulatory matters. And some of you have also probably met Amanda in her former role, where prior to BOEM, she was the first Assistant Secretary for Energy and Environment for the state of New York, leading the development and implementation of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or the Climate Act. So welcome to David, Andrew, and Amanda. So I have some questions for you all, and we will save time at the end for audience questions too. But just to start off, just a general question for everyone. So how do you think the New York's existing offshore wind projects and pipeline of offshore wind developments contribute to achieving the clean energy goals under the Climate Act?
You should go to Amanda.
Maybe Amanda.
I'll set the stage. Can you all hear me okay? Is my mic on? Excellent.
Well, first, it's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. So, of course, the Climate Act, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, set a really ambitious path for the state of New York. I'll still call it a leader in the nation on fighting climate change. And there are many goals included in the CLCPA, one of which, of course, is a goal to achieve 9,000 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035. Which is an incredibly ambitious goal, but fortunately the state of New York is well on track to achieve that goal through the great work of the Department of Public Service, the New York State Energy and Research Development Authority, and many other state agencies. I believe there's, over 4 gigawatts under contract at this time. But I think another piece of that, which is probably even more important for somebody like Andrew that has to think about what we're going to do for New York City, is not only does offshore wind fit into just the very clear goal to build 9 gigs of offshore wind by 2035, but as we think about the challenges that New York has, one of which is how are we going to decarbonize the economy, and specifically when we have increased demand, doubling the demand by mid-century, how are we going to decarbonize places like New York City? And so I think offshore wind is a really important, unique opportunity for the state of New York to really help ensure that New York City is going to be able to achieve their really ambitious climate goals, as well as, of course, the CLCPA.
Yeah, I would just say from an economic development perspective, offshore wind is nothing less than a gift from the gods. That's a technical expression. We have this unique opportunity to benefit from this moment of time when you have this alignment between the city, state, and the federal government locking arms around getting us off of fossil fuels, meeting our green economy goals, creating real equity in EJ communities that haven't had it. An opportunity, and just think about it, to bring large-scale manufacturing back to the waterfront in New York City, not just in South Brooklyn, but on the West Shore of Staten Island, the South Shore. Really an astonishing moment. And so, we are focused on all of those elements, but just in terms of the size of the industry and how fast it's been growing, we heard a little bit about, how 10 years ago nobody was really talking about it. And 10, 12 years ago, I was looking out the window from Industry City at the 75-acre South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, controlled by the city's Economic Development Corporation, which I now run, but 6 failed RFPs over a 40-year period, trying to figure out what kind of industrial maritime could be brought back to the city. And us thinking across the street at Industry City, how do we capitalize on that policy imperative to bring good paying jobs and deal with our climate challenges, partnering up with a maritime operator to bid. And during that period of time we were thinking about bidding was when Equinor won the first land water lease from BOEM for about, 80,000 acres of water. I think they paid $40 million, and everybody just gasped. How could that possibly be? NYCERDA had been talking about acquiring that water. They were blown out of the water from a financing point of view. But then you fast forward it to a couple years ago with the most recent power purchase bids, and all of them came, for the same amount of water, all of them came up in the high hundreds of millions of dollars. So the private sector is responding. We have a unique opportunity. We just got to make sure we don't screw it up.
Not much more that I could add. I will say I'm grateful to be here. I'm excited to talk to you about Ørsted and the position that we're playing in New York, but also in the country and in the globe. It's a unique opportunity to work for a company like Ørsted that's, of course, publicly traded for profit, but very mission driven. And I joke with my team and with others that it's a company that no one's ever heard of, but probably is deploying the most capital in the energy transition in America, or maybe number 2. And so we're really happy to be playing that significant role in this energy transition. But maybe one little point to your question that I would add is that there are other technologies, right? There's carbon capture, there's land-based wind and solar, but there's no other technology where you can deploy so much capital and get so much energy production. Offshore wind is twice as, or more than double the, let me say it this other way. Solar is double the intermittency as offshore wind. So offshore wind is a different product. Basically, it's much more closer to a base load of a traditional power plant, and to do that in large, number of megawatts and megawatt hours close to load centers. We have some of the best wind in the world. We have relatively shallow continental shelf that goes out, and so this opportunity, it is a blessing from God because it's the natural resources that are available between the water depth, the wind speed, and the location. We just need to all continue to keep our arms locked and try to bring this forward, because as Jim said, we're in stage 3. I would say stage 3 of 10 stages or something. We're not in stage 3 of 3 stages. We've got a long ways to go still before this really becomes mainstream and more easy. So.
Yeah, great. Thanks, David. And David, I think you provided kind of a great segue for my next question, which was, to ask you a little bit. Ørsted is obviously a leader globally in offshore wind, and certainly in the U.S. as well. So could you provide a brief overview of some of the wind development that you have that affects New York? I know your team has had some really great project milestones recently, so if you wanted to talk a little bit about those.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just a quick introduction on Ørsted, just in case folks don't know the awkward name. It's based off of a Danish scientist that founded electromagnetism. So everything related to motors and electricity really started with this gentleman, Hans Ørsted. We were an oil and gas company that transitioned to 100% renewable energy about 10 years ago, shed all of our traditional oil and gas business and are 100% focused on renewable energy. We started we built the world's first offshore wind farm 31 years ago, and today we're the market leader by a lot in offshore wind globally. But in the last few years, we've expanded beyond just offshore wind to have a sizable onshore wind, and more recently a P2X business. We call it P2X, is green fuels and green hydrogen. And so we're building, we've got about 4 gigawatts of solar and wind onshore, and building another 1.6 or 7 as we speak. We're building the world's second largest utility scale battery storage system coupled with solar out in Arizona. So we do a lot of things besides offshore wind, but offshore wind is still our core business. And in New York, I'm super excited that today we're building New York's first offshore wind farm, the South Fork Wind Farm. We've got 5 foundations installed. Today we're installing the offshore substation. So you bring the power to an offshore substation first, and then you bring it to shore on an export cable. And so that offshore substation is actually being installed off the coast of Montauk as we speak, literally, hopefully set on the foundation today. And we expect to build that project through the rest of the summer, probably installing turbines in September and completing the project by the end of the year. It's 132 megawatts, which is roughly around 500,000 New York homes of power. By today's standards, it's not the largest offshore wind project, but it's important because it's the first project, and it's the first utility scale project, and it's been in the works for, I think, 10, 11 years, just showing how long it takes to get these projects built. And we see it as a nice segue from our small pilot 5-turbine Block Island project to this phase of utility scale. But next year we'll be building 2 more projects, one for New England and one for New Jersey, and then probably starting some onshore construction for our second big New York project, the Sunrise Wind Project, which is 930 megawatts-ish. I should know that number. 930, I think it's 924, yeah. And that we expect to have built by 2025, and then we've got an active solicitation right now with NYCERDA for a 3rd project, which is even larger than these 2 combined. So.
Great, awesome. Congratulations on all of that too. I think
Thank
it's
you.
really exciting. It's an exciting time. Andrew, I think you talked about this in your your last remarks, talking about kind of EDC and the role in the market. I think we're excited to see that as well. The Consortium is a partner on the Offshore Wind Innovation Hub in Industry City, which is led up through by Equinor with EDC as a partner, as well as NYU's Urban Future Lab and others. And so I know I've been really excited to be in the space in Industry City, looking out at the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal and all that's going on there. I think it's a really exciting time. So could you speak a little bit about what your kind of vision for New York City and the offshore wind market, kind of locally and globally, how it kind of could play in?
Sure. I mean, first of all, it's been amazing to get to work with companies like Ørsted and Equinor, and there are a number of others. Most of them were European-based and are 20 years ahead of most of our companies here. They are now playing catch-up, which is great, and there's more and more competition in the market. They may not love to hear that, but they really are tremendous companies, and it's been a great learning experience, I think, for all of us in economic development in New York to learn from them and alongside them. We've got to get this right. For us, getting it right means bringing 1,000 jobs to the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal that hasn't seen any jobs in 50 or 60 years, having 300 permanent jobs there servicing these turbines, linking those jobs to local folks in the community. We're investing enormously in workforce development programs, both locally and then at the CUNY level with a $10 million investment with 4 different schools. Super important. We want to build up the ecosystem around it with supply chain efforts. So we're doing rigorous deep dives into the supply chain to understand how local businesses can participate. And we think, going to your comments a minute ago, David, there is a broader ecosystem of businesses here around climate tech where there's lots of overlap. And a lot of that may connect into the kinds of sectors we're trying to grow that will benefit from Local Law 97, as an example. And so one of the amazing things about EDC is we have 66 million square feet of space that we manage, 20 million actively. 20 million of that is on the waterfront, whether in Staten Island or in the Bronx or in Brooklyn. And we want to make sure the assets that we manage, like the Brooklyn Army Terminal or the Made in New York campus, become the home for so many of those small startups that will play a role in the broader picture.
Great. Very exciting. So to shift gears a little bit, I'm going to turn to Amanda, and you had a great role as kind of leadership through BOEM. So can you talk a little bit about the role of the federal government in the development of offshore wind and, in the guise of the Biden administration's really ambitious goal of reaching 30 gigawatts by 2030?
Sure. Well, something Andrew said, many things that Andrew said are sitting with me, well said. But something that I thought is really important is just sort of the unique opportunity in the place we find ourselves right now, which is what an incredible moment when we have alignment from New York City, New York, and the federal government on our climate goals. And really, we're not just trying to build offshore wind, but the city, state, and federal government have all said we're building offshore wind not just to fight climate change, but also to benefit underserved communities that have been historically disadvantaged and to create good-paying union jobs. And I think that is a really unique and important opportunity that we're all seeking to harness, because when President Biden, in fact, actually when his cabinet secretary set this incredibly ambitious target, it was with those really important values in mind. So as we move forward, and we've got a pretty significant road ahead. We currently, again, have 42 megawatts of installed capacity in the United States, and we're going to go from 42 megawatts to 30 gigawatts between now and 2030. So that's a really tremendous challenge. And not only that, the Biden-Harris administration also set a goal of 15 gigawatts of floating offshore wind by 2035, which I think is really important because I think the United States is well positioned to be a leader in floating globally if we go after it fast and ambitiously enough. And I'll say that I agreed with everything Jim said except for one piece because he did a really good job summarizing where we are. But because Jim talked about this one other piece, which is that energy projects are facing inflation, which is true. But as we think about the road ahead, this is obviously not the question you asked me, but I still wanted to respond to it. But we think about the road ahead, I just think it's really important to remember that it's not renewable energy that's facing inflation. Every infrastructure project is facing inflation. And it's not a choice between offshore wind and something cheaper. All projects are seeing rising costs. And so I think that's really important context. So as we think about, well, what's the federal government going to do as we move forward to achieve our really ambitious goals, there's a few things. One is we have the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the single largest investment in climate in our history. It is game-changing, and it is incredibly important. And it's also incredibly important that the federal government gets the implementation of the IRA right, so that the early projects, because David has 6 lease areas, which is far more than any other company in the United States, so that as David goes to go pursue these projects, he's able to tap into those really important incentives. So that's one piece that the federal government needs to do. And I, of course, am incredibly biased, but I think the most important thing that the federal government has done and needs to continue to do is permitting and leasing. That's very obvious, I hope, to many of you that I think that is the most important thing that the federal government does. We have gone from 2 projects under review, which are the 2 projects that were first approved, now we're at 3 projects, to now 10, and that's really remarkable. There has been so much progress made under this administration that they've initiated the review of 10 projects. And excitingly, Ocean Winds, which David mentioned, is actually the first project that the notice of intent and the record of decision was actually issued by this administration. So incredible progress so far. We've already seen 3 auctions behind us, and we've got the Gulf of Mexico now happening at the end of August. And then, of course, there's Central Atlantic and the Gulf of Maine to look forward to. So to summarize what I said, which is really long, of course, we need the federal government to keep moving forward with incentives to ensure that this industry becomes a reality as everyone is facing rising costs from inflation, and 2, to keep going to make sure that these projects get approved in a timely manner.
I'll just highlight too, like what you said about the federal government is so true. And just remember, we went through a 4-year period when everything slowed down and there was discussion about oil drilling off of the East Coast. So like
Same agency. Yeah.
Critically important role that you all play at the federal level. And then I just want to say at the state level, I don't think anybody's highlighted the role of NYCERDA, but none of this happens without NYCERDA, and they are just an unbelievable agency, and our collaborative work with them has been fantastic, and I think will only grow in the coming years.
It's a great point. I hope NYCERDA's not here. I'm sorry, NYCERDA.
Maybe just a couple comments for me. I think it has been a 180-degree, pivot from, the previous administration to the current administration. And whatever your politics are, I don't want to get into that, but it's an objective standard that nothing was happening. Now tons of activity has happened. Amanda, rattled off a lot of the stats, but to take I know it's competitive between New York and New Jersey, but to take our New Jersey project, the Ocean Wind projects, from beginning to end is a huge accomplishment from BOEM. And now we actually expect at least one more project to achieve its record of decision later this year, and one in early part of next year, the Sunrise project. The second New York project is hopefully early next year. And once we have those records of decision, we move right into construction. So we'll start our onshore construction of both of those projects. Might even start Sunrise onshore construction before we get the ROD this year, if we can. We're working with the agency to see if they'll let us do that. So it's really positive. And the alignment between the federal government, the state government, and the local government, I think, is unique. And I think New York, I have to be friends to everybody, but New York is the most sophisticated, state with respect to all this stuff, and a lot of that is NYCERDA's team that really understands in this playing the long game, and I think we'll position New York really strongly for the future. They can sometimes make things a little complicated, but definitely a bunch of good folks, smart folks there. So.
Yeah, that's great. And I should note too, the consortium, which I lead, was founded through the work of NYCERDA. So NYCERDA won a competitive bid from the Department of Energy and matched that funding to form our nonprofit organization, which started with $41 million to support R&D projects, competitive research projects to support offshore wind. So certainly NYCERDA, in our role too, has been a leader in offshore wind. And so I'm just looking around, making sure we haven't offended anybody by not mentioning NYCERDA earlier. But yes,
I did say NYCERDA earlier. I feel terrible. I'm gonna call Doreen later. I will also just note, because I do think it's important. Not only is NYCERDA a national leader, and there are really great leadership from states all across the country. And I'm a New Yorker though, so I'm biased, and I think Doreen Ayers is one of the most incredible people out there. But also, and importantly, we have the Department of Public Service in the room too, and I think it's, we can't forget the really important role that other agencies play. So NYCERDA is leading the way, innovating and putting out these procurements, and then we have other state agencies like the Department of Public Service that of course are thinking about this from a ratepayer perspective and make sure that these procurements are possible. So I think what's awesome about New York is not just NYCERDA's incredible leadership, but the interagency all coming together to make this reality in the state.
Well, and I would say, so to continue that thread, I'll kind of throw this to all the panelists. What do you see as the state, federal, and kind of city policies that have been most effective in supporting offshore wind, and which have been obstacles? I think maybe it was Jim in his opening remarks talked about kind of the road to building has been long. It's taken a long time to get to where we are. The permitting process has been long. I think it's great to see more steel in the water and things like that. So just your perspective on kind of what policies have been effective and what might have been a bit of an obstacle.
I can start. I mean, for sure, the most profound legislative thing that's happened in this country related to climate and renewables and offshore wind is the IRA. I mean, it's some estimates $1.6 trillion of incentives for the energy transition. So we'll have to see. It is mostly tax credits. Brings up a whole other topic we can talk about, which is how do you monetize those tax credits. But there's a lot of little nuance in this business that people don't appreciate. But and monetizing tax credits is going to be one of the challenges in implementing the IRA. But that is a game changer for this country, and not just for this country, but for the world, because it put America back in a leadership position, and it caused the European Union to have to respond and create their energy policy. In Canada and other countries, China even, people are responding to that in a geopolitical way, which hopefully benefits the globe. And so there's still a lot of work to do to implement that. A lot of the guidance is not finalized, so I don't think any of that $1.6 trillion is flying out the door yet. Maybe some extension of the traditional solar and wind. People are probably counting on that. But for offshore wind, there were 2 new bonus credits that were made available. And right now the industry is still kind of waiting to see, what is the guidance on those and how do we implement those. And as Amanda said, for the early projects and for the domestic supply chain for the U.S., which is what the administration wants at the federal level and the states all want, we really need these first projects to be successful. And what we haven't talked about yet, we've talked about it a little bit with inflation, but the first projects are facing some headwind, not only inflation related to input costs, but also rising interest rates. And I don't know that people really appreciate how sensitive infrastructure projects in general, but renewable energy infrastructure projects in particular, how sensitive they are to interest rates. We don't have a fuel. We deploy a whole bunch of equipment up front, and then we have to, earn back that revenue to pay for that big investment up front. And so rising interest rates are really, we're really really sensitive to rising interest rates. And interest rates have risen, 250, 300 basis points. So that, ballpark-ish figures between $15 and $20 per megawatt hour just for every 100 basis point of interest rate increase. And so that's having a big impact on either project viability or the price of power for our industry. So we've got to do everything we can right now to help the industry get out of the blocks. There's a lot of positive progress, but we really have 5 foundations installed, and Vineyard has maybe 8. So we have a long ways to go before we're really, building large offshore wind farms, and it's, flowing like a mature industry. And so anything that the federal government can do to help these first projects, have project viability and kind of offload some of the cost to the individual states, because if there's no support from the federal government, then either projects aren't going to get built or states are going to have to, pay developers more, or else the economics just don't work right now. So that to me is one of the most critical things that we need to do, is get the guidance right and try to phase it in so that So if the first projects are successful, so we build a demand signal so that all of the supply chain investments come here. If the first projects fail, or they're shaky, or they're unknown, or people are pausing or delaying, then it's difficult for a developer like me to give a firm commitment to my supply chain, and then it's difficult for them to make an investment here in the US. I'm building a factory or building a ship or building a port or whatever. So the number one thing in my mind, if there's one message, it's we need to have a strong demand signal for offshore wind. And the states are doing that with their targets, and Biden's doing that with 30 gigawatt target. But unless the projects are viable and I can make commitments to the supply chain, we're really not going to move this forward. So.
I think that's right on spot. You know, I mean, from my perspective, the federal government, you know, between Treasury and the Fed and the White House and policymaking is doing pretty much everything they can. I am glass half full that, you know, in terms of inflation, it's stabilizing. We're seeing, you know, the same increases in construction costs across the $9 billion portfolio of other projects we have outside of offshore wind. We see, you know, some of those costs starting to stabilize though, and hopefully they won't not only stabilize but come down a little bit. You know, in terms of other challenges that you didn't mention that I think we should highlight in this discussion though is, you know, assuming we get everything else right and we start to put these wind turbines 15 to 30 miles offshore and bring the cables in, the question is where are the cables coming into and what's the grid that's receiving it and what's the condition of that grid. And I think that's when I said at the beginning, like, we got to make sure we don't screw it up, like that is in that bucket of things. And obviously at SBMT, there's going to be the opportunity through the substation that's going to get built there to, you know, receive, you know, 10% of New York City's future power. But we're going to need lots of those interconnection points, and it's not clear where all of them are going to be. And if once we decide where they can go, will the permitting be in place? Will the economics be in place? And so I just, you know, that is another critical thing. We're working very hard at EDC to identify every possible piece of real estate that can be a part of this. And, you know, talk to NYPA, talk to Con Ed, talk to every other player in the industry to, you know, make sure that we don't miss the opportunity when it comes.
But New York, again, is probably ahead of others because they've already ran a PPTN process and awarded some grid upgrade costs for Long Island, and it's anticipated they're going to have another public policy transmission need, PPTN process for New York City as well. And so it's a super critical point that you're making, but at least the policymakers in New York are anticipating that and starting to try to plan for how to build the transmission infrastructure needed to bring this power in.
So my esteemed panelists hit on the 2 points that I would have attempted to make. I was hoping you weren't going to mention PPTN, save me something, but just to sort of give you a sense, right, of, you know, Andrew's so right to point out that this is such a significant challenge for New York, but to underline the point that David is making with respect to how much further along New York is than other places. You know, not only, of course, did the PPTN process move forward and identified the need offshore here in New York has also, of course, as part of their Accelerated Renewables Community Benefit Act, which I think is the name of that act, it's a very long name, included in that a directive to actually study transmission, and part of that was looking at offshore wind and how you facilitate that. So there's been a lot of analysis underway from NYPA, the Department of Public Service, and of course NYCERDA, in thinking about how to move this forward for several years. And of course NYCERDA looked to that, and their New York 3 bid included Mesh Ready as part of their procurement. So New York has done a lot of thinking about this compared to other markets, right, where I will, just note the challenges ahead of somewhere like California, for instance, where you have several lease areas in the northern part of California and literally no transmission that exists to get it to load centers like LA and San Francisco and other places in the middle of the state. And I call that out as an example because we talked about how important offshore wind is. One of the things we didn't mention is the fact that most people live on our coast, so it just makes a heck of a lot of sense to build energy near people. But compared to the West Coast, which is just really in the very beginning stages, we've got a lot of thinking behind our belts here on the East Coast. The last problem, I'm not sure if you had a question on transmission, so I'm just riffing now. The last challenge, of course, though, and I think it'll be really interesting, and I think it's been positive to see developers really evolve on this over the years, is we have, Jim noted 27 active lease areas. I don't remember, but I think that's just on the East Coast. I don't think that includes the provisional winners on the West Coast. So that's a lot of radial lines from individual projects going into the state. And so as we think about over time, not only do the states need to be thoughtful like New York, but the federal government also really needs to evolve their thinking on how we're going to actually move away from radial lines from individual projects and think about more comprehensive solutions as we move forward. So just a note, so not only is transmission really important on the state level, but at the federal level, that's something that there needs to be a lot of evolution and progress on in order for us to solve that challenge.
Sorry, I thought of something else during all this conversation. It's a little bit tangential to the topic, but I think it's important because I think we have a mixed audience out here. When we talk about affordability of offshore wind, it's kind of become a hot topic right now. There's some developers who are, walking away from their offtake agreements that they have with the states. There's developers, I'll raise my hand, I'm one of them, that are in discussion with states trying to renegotiate. And there's projects where we have active solicitations in New York. We just this past week heard that Rhode Island didn't choose our project, and they cited affordability as one of the challenges. I think is a little bit of a misnomer out there about affordability for offshore wind, because you're not comparing apples to apples. For offshore wind, we're trying to catch up for 30 years of being behind, basically, and we're trying to build a supply chain here, infrastructure here, and do all this grid upgrade work that we need to do. And if I broke out the power price for generating power in offshore wind, it would probably be like 2/3 of the price. It wouldn't be at least 1/3 of the prices. I don't know the exact number. Actually, Christian on my team is here. He probably could give me a better percentage, but a whole bunch of cost is related to investment in ports, investment in vessels, investment in grid upgrade, investment in ships, I said that already, investment in manufacturing plants, investment in training programs, et cetera, et cetera. So you're not really comparing apples to apples if you have all these one-time fixed costs, but we've got to make those investments. We could do it in a different way. Right now we embed all those costs into the megawatt hour price, so it looks like, wow, offshore wind's really expensive, but you're getting so much more than just clean power from offshore wind. You're getting, job creation, whole new industries, literally thousands, if not tens of thousands or 20s of thousands of people. You're getting more resilient grids. You're getting multi-use ports that can be used for other things. And I just don't think that people really understand that we probably have, as an industry, haven't done a good job of isolating like what does offshore wind cost so that we can compare apples to apples, and then highlight all this other stuff as the benefits that are coming along for the ride.
Great point.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to thank my panel because you already answered questions I didn't ask. So I had some on here about kind of economics, and I think you guys did a great job kind of talking about some of those, as well as I did want to speak a little bit about transmission. And I will say, for me personally, transmission is something that I feel like we started talking about really late in the game. In offshore wind, it seemed like it really became a big part of the conversation only a few years ago. And so it feels like we do need to kind of move some of these conversations forward, and it's good to see it as more of a common topic in our development, particularly on the East Coast. And I think there has been some lessons learned from the East Coast, and you are hearing about it kind of right away on the West Coast, in California and Oregon and other places where they're acknowledging the transmission challenges as they build this industry. So I think it's something that it's one of the key challenges that we face with offshore wind, thinking about kind of transmission and interconnection. So to shift gears a little bit, I think, before I turn it over to some audience questions, we've talked about this a little bit, but I was wondering if, maybe all the panelists could talk about, maybe some of both the challenges and opportunities, and we've kind of alluded to this, but, both on supply chain. So there's a massive amount that's needed to move our industry forward. But there's challenges related to supply chain, and there's opportunities. And the soapbox that I often get on as a scientist, as someone that works in offshore wind, is the opportunities in workforce and workforce development. And so as a researcher, I see opportunities for scientists and folks coming into the field to kind of use their expertise in offshore wind. But I think kind of soup to nuts, there's kind of huge opportunities in workforce development as well. So just kind of a general question to the audience, or to the panel, is maybe you can talk a little bit what you see as maybe perhaps some challenges and some opportunities with supply chain and workforce.
Well, I could start. I mean, I would just say first, we would not have these laws in place driving us towards a green economy without young people. So these policy discussions are awesome, but the politics of it were young people and environmental justice communities demanded it. And so we have to do everything possible to make sure that we create the pipeline into these jobs. And so, we're just at the very beginning of this. And so, there's little anecdotal evidence of successes. I heard just the other day that Equinor is already training 10 diverse students at the Harbor School to be working on their installations, flying them down to Louisiana for training. That's pretty awesome. Now that's teeny, and we've got to put that on steroids across the board, and we're trying to lay the foundation with our partnerships with CUNY, with the kinds of local workforce development stuff that we're going to be doing in Sunset Park and elsewhere around job placement. So there's just a tremendous opportunity long term. And again, when I say let's not screw it up, one of the ways we could screw it up is to make sure that this industry does not look like New York in terms of its diversity. And so we need to make sure that we get that right. And that's one of the key goals of EDC across all the sectors that we're involved in, life sciences or cyber or AI or advanced manufacturing, film, television, gaming, all of those sectors, same story. We've got to create the pipelines. We've got to work with places like CUNY so that the vocational aspects of these industries are embedded in what they do, and that there is experiential learning while they're in school. I was not a good classroom learner. I had to be doing stuff. I think there are a lot of people out there like that, and we're trying to do that across sectors, particularly in the life sciences, where you get students into the laboratory. We've got to be doing the same exact thing in the offshore wind industry.
I think that was really well said and an exciting opportunity, Andrew. I would note a couple of things. I think, as we've really already noted, is that I think it's sort of the opportunity is also the challenge, which is this is a brand new industry in the United States. It is not a brand new industry globally. So the opportunity is we get to create this brand new supply chain and this brand new industry in the United States. And that's incredibly exciting. And we can do so in a way that creates union jobs, that benefits underserved communities, that really provides economic benefits to this nation. And the challenge is this is a brand new industry to the United States, and we have to build a brand new supply chain in the United States and yet do it at the pace and scale that is necessary to achieve our climate goals. So that it's both the challenge and the opportunity are really one and the same here. And I think it really is, in my view, just incredibly exciting to see the moment that we're in, because we will see more and more Vineyard and South Fork as they continue to move forward. Hopefully over time we're going to see less and less components shipped to us from overseas, and instead those components are going to be built here in America. I think more and more as we think about how we transition away from fossil fuels, we're going to think about how we can really work with communities in places like the Gulf of Mexico to transition them. The first wind turbine installation vessel, which is being built by Dominion under contract with developers like Ørsted, is being built in Galveston, Texas. The steel jackets for the nation's first project off of Rhode Island were built in the Gulf region, right? I mean, there's just a tremendous opportunity to build a new supply chain and to do it in a way that not only benefits underserved communities in the state of New York, but also helps us transition away from oil and gas and communities that have been historically dependent on them.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you just said, and I think it's really exciting nationally. It's exciting regionally. This is not a zero-sum game. I mean, we're going to fight tooth and nail to get large-scale manufacturing on the west shore of Staten Island. But you know what? If there's a lot of manufacturing that goes to New Jersey or Delaware, that's good for the region. It's good for the country. I will say, though, we do have a unique opportunity on the west shore of Staten Island with about 70 acres where we just had a conditional designation. We're going to put capital behind it. It's just adjacent to 200 acres of privately held, really industrial dystopia, but is right on the water and has this unique opportunity to be repositioned, whether it's for turbine manufacturing or nacelle or the poles or cables or hopefully all of the above. And you know what? It's awesome that NYCERDA is driving some of this local content upstate as well, Coymans and other places along the Hudson. It's a tremendous opportunity, and we've got to get over some of this pricing hurdle and make sure that we do everything we can to not only have those first projects move forward, but nail some of the large-scale manufacturing in the region.
You know, you hit sort of another important specific challenge though, right? And it's good to hear you say it. I hope somebody wrote down that Andrew just said, if anybody gets it in the region, we're okay with that.
I said I'm going to fight like Al.
But it is, that is another important challenge, right? Which is that the economic opportunities are so important, and those investments are incredibly important. And how do we make sure that, as all of those states are rightfully ensuring that they benefit from this, it's not in a manner that's duplicative and further rises up costs, right? So that's another thing to just consider. But I hope Staten Island gets it too.
I think there's, maybe just let me back up a little bit and then I'll augment. But when you think about the jobs, I break into 4 categories. The first category is that you've got these what I call infrastructure jobs. So you're building ports, you're building factories, the building of the factories themselves, you're building vessels, and there are literally hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars that need to go into that part of it. Then there's the actual manufacturing jobs, working in those factories to produce components, whatever that is, blades, nacelles, cables, etc. And those are long-term jobs, probably many cases could be union jobs as well. The construction jobs should definitely be union jobs. And then you've got the construction of the wind farms, including the offshore part and the onshore part. So there's a lot of onshore work people don't realize, but you got to build a big onshore substation, cable route, and then you've got to build the cable collector systems offshore, the offshore substation, the turbine erecting the turbines, construction, et cetera. So that's another category of jobs. And the last category is actually operating the wind farms for the life of the project, 30 years. And these offshore O&M jobs, operation and maintenance jobs are, they're high-paid jobs. They could be 6-figure jobs without a college education. And at least what we're leaning towards is a 10 days on, 10 days off type of role where you live on a ship and you go to work every day on the turbines, but you stay on the ship at night so that we don't have transit time, and then you come back every 10 days and you're off for 10 days and still make a 6-figure job. That's a pretty good job. It's not no offense to Amazon, but you're not filling cardboard boxes in a factory somewhere in a warehouse. So, but you put all that out there, there's just so much opportunity, so much potential, but we've got to take it stepwise. If we set the bar too high and make the standards too high, that we stifle the initial growth of this industry and we slow down the demand signal, which I said before, then we'll miss the opportunity. But economics, and I'm all for incentives from the state or from the federal government to help speed up the domestication of the supply chain. But it would happen anyway. If you have a good demand signal for the growth of the industry, people will come and invest here because these are big giant components. The logistics are so expensive. There's a cost savings just to not have to ship these 40-ton tower components over to across the sea, for example. And so I just come back to that it's really important that we help the industry get out of the blocks, get the first projects built, give that positive demand signal, and then Ørsted for sure. We've done a ton of things already to try to make this a domestic supply chain. We've signed the National Offshore Wind Agreement with NAB2, the National Labor Agreement, to do all of our onshore and offshore construction work under project labor agreements. We have really high standards for women and minority-owned, veteran-owned, disabled folks, trying to bring them into the industry. We've got economic development and training programs. I think we've got a total budget so far just on our existing projects of over $27 million just going into training programs to help people come into the industry across some of our different projects. So there's just so much potential, but we just gotta get out of the blocks on these first projects. And I'm not here to be the bearer of bad news, but I'm nervous. I'm nervous when you see projects being canceled and when you see states, not awarding projects. It makes me nervous about do we really have a viable industry getting started here? 18 months ago, I was on cloud 9, thought it was on fire, but right now I'm honestly a little bit nervous.
Thanks. Well, I certainly have more questions I could ask the panel, but we wanted to give the audience an opportunity to ask our esteemed panelists some questions. So I think Jordan's back there with a microphone. We'll just kind of throw to the audience, and I saw up here first. I saw your hand first, so go ahead. Sorry, Jordan, making you run across the room.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew Shapiro from Broadscale Group. Great panel. I agree with David's nervous concern. Read the Barron's piece from this past weekend.
Fortune magazine also, like 2 days ago.
Tough press right now. I'm an investor in climate tech. I also work with 3 of the major players here, BP, Shell, and Equinor. So my question is, what's the role of innovation, both tech innovation, investing, whether it's in floating technology, storage, or business model innovation? So BP's CEO is quoted in that piece saying, we're going to integrate offshore wind with our hydrogen projects, with other green fuels, as you've discussed. He even said, and I'm not sure this is possible, we're going to earmark those electrons for our EV charging needs. I'd love to hear from the panel quickly about how you think innovation, including the Innovation Hub that Pat's involved in, that I visited, plays a key role here in making this cost effective.
Maybe I'll start. I mean, innovation, like in all things, it really, really matters. And it's this 30 years of innovation that's happened elsewhere that's made offshore wind so mainstream in other parts of the world. But this is the opportunity. We talk a lot about the manufacturing jobs and the blue collar jobs, but we have an opportunity in the U.S. to be innovators of the technology itself, not just in floating, but the core technology, if we so desire. And there's plenty of opportunity for us to continue to decrease the levelized cost of energy for renewables writ large and offshore wind in particular. We've got an innovation team, global innovation team, but also here in the U.S. we've started a in-house VC innovation fund to co-invest into innovation projects or companies. Where we've got a bunch of pilots right now, especially around marine mammal protection, and there's a lot of course we want to do these projects sustainably and have a net positive biodiversity impact. But in order to do that with today's technology, you have vessel speed restrictions, you have pile driving restrictions, and so we're saying, can we use technology to protect the marine mammals, but speed up our vessels and be able to pile drive 24/7 or not pile drive, have self-installed monopiles that don't need to be pile drive. There's a different way to embed them into the sea floor. So the simple answer is innovation really, really matters, I think. So.
Yeah, I would just jump in. I mean, innovation obviously is driven by the private sector. Public sector can incent in a lot of ways. You think about post-2008, there were very few tech jobs in New York City. They now have 355,000, core part of our economy. Very few life sciences jobs. Now, if you look at the metro area, we have more life sciences investment and jobs than the Bay Area or Boston area. Not the cities, but area. That's a pretty astonishing stat. And as it compares to the cities, we're doing much better in that space. Same thing is happening in climate tech, green tech. You look at all the projections going out, and you have to have a long-term view here. The investment is going to be far greater in green tech, climate tech than any other sector. And so how do we drive that? It's things like the Innovation Hub at Industry City, and EDC has done this for years and years with accelerators, incubators, with using our 60 million square feet of space and then tens of millions of other square feet of space on city-owned assets to pilot technologies, and you're going to be hearing a lot more of this. If you're into this kind of stuff and the future of New York, you should read the new New York report that the mayor and the governor came out with about a year ago, and EDC had a big part in drafting that, and one of those initiatives was all about piloting climate tech and new technologies on our assets. We've already rolled out 4 or 5 at the Brooklyn Army Terminal as an example. So that's a role that we can play in that.
Well, in the spirit of not answering questions asked to start with, I will just note first that I'm actually not worried. I am, like ever, the optimist, almost painfully, I'm sure, for people around me. But I'm not actually so nervous about whether or not the United States will make offshore wind a reality here. I think at some point, I would say before the Biden-Harris administration, there was a real question, which is, will offshore wind happen in the United States? And I think we can firmly say, not only will it, it is. I think the question in front of us now that is different with where we find ourselves is, what will the pace and scale of that development be? So I'm not worried about it being reality, it is. What the pace and scale will be, that is the question. And I think with respect to the points that David has made, I really can't agree more. We must move forward with the early projects to build the momentum and ensure that we have invested enough to ensure that we have the supply chain here. And the reason is not because of whether or not we will make offshore wind a reality, it's whether or not we will achieve the multiple goals of the city, state, and federal government in making offshore wind a reality. And what I mean by that is, offshore wind is already happening. How do we get it right? How we get it right is we create a big enough demand so that we can get those economic benefits to disadvantaged communities, so that we can ensure that these projects are built in a responsible manner, so that we can ensure that we are building them union. And the way that we do that is create that early demand, and I think that is so necessary as a foundation. What role will innovation play? I think innovation will play a very big role in not only achieving that. David mentioned, marine mammal. I think we really do need technology, and coming as a former regulator here, there are some significant challenges that we still have to solve on the permitting level. I mean, we have critically endangered species on the East Coast. We haven't talked so much about sort of the environmental regulatory frameworks here, but I think that will be a really important thing. And another thing is we haven't talked about is, of course, my former wonderful colleagues at the Department of Energy who are really helping to think about that, are funders of some of the organizations that we're here with today. And as we think about that goal that I mentioned earlier of 15 gigawatts of floating wind by 2035, we're going to need significant innovation in order to make that happen. And part of that goal of 15 gigs by 2035, it's obviously BOEM's job to do the leasing and to make sure that we're deploying that capacity and getting those projects built and reviewed on time. But DOE has taken up the mantle of how can we fund innovation grants to help drive down the cost of floating to make that a reality. So I think it's certainly a really important component of how we're going to achieve our goals in the United States. And of course, I'll bring it home to New York since we're here. As New York is thinking about its master plan, New York is actually looking to floating as well, right? So innovation is going to be important on the floating side across the country.
Carrie, go ahead.
So I'm Carrie Goldnick with Lyndie Offshore, and I appreciate all your comments. First of all, Mr. Mark, we put on our substation on our jacket foundations last night, so great news.
Hey, congrats!
I have that picture also. My team sent me your pictures and our pictures. Yeah.
I want to ask a trickier question, or kind of dig a little bit more into this, and maybe push back a little bit, Amanda, on your optimism and the concern that David expressed, which people that know me, this is like keeping me up at night right now, which I think there is this disconnect between ratepayers and who actually are paying the cost of these investments, which we all support and need, and the investments themselves. So here in New York, I think the commission has the capability to recognize the overarching benefits of offshore wind infrastructure and the energy prices that we're showing them. I am concerned about the other states not having that capability to compare apples and oranges and make the right choice when it comes to ratepayer impact and the cost of offshore wind. How do we improve the situation, not only from a messaging standpoint, but from a ratepayer impact standpoint, so that people understand when they pay the kilowatt hour price for offshore wind, all these other things are coming into it. It's not just an energy price. Because I do think there's a disconnect, and it's going to be a problem. I personally feel that.
It's also a fixed price, because right now you might think that it looks expensive, but tell me what the price of gas in the winter is going to be in 2041. Nobody can do that. We have no idea what that's going to be and what that's going to translate into electricity costs in New York or Massachusetts or Rhode Island. So at least with offshore wind, it might look high today, but it's fixed. You know that price is basically locked in. But it is a real concern. I mean, I don't want to get into too much detail, but obviously we've been having discussions over the last few days, weeks or so with the state of Rhode Island, and there's a disconnect for sure in the way they are looking at it and the way we're looking at it, at least. So,
you know, Carrie, there's not like an easy answer to your question, but it's a really important one, and you can answer your question several ways. You know, but I think we're going to see, I expect, changes in the way that states move forward with their procurements. I think we're going to see, different kinds of approaches. But I think how we sort of change the conversation will not be easy. And, you know, I keep talking about the Department of Public Service, and it's not just because Roar is here, but like that's the hard job, right? Like, how do you talk to the ratepayers about these impacts? And I think that there's a few things that we just need to continue to really talk about. And like, one is everything Andrew is saying, right? I mean, you know, think about the incredible economic opportunities that uniquely is happening because of offshore wind. That doesn't happen with other forms of energy. The other thing is again, it's this false choice. You know, undoubtedly there are other costs that are a part of offshore wind that are not true for other industries that are already established because they already have their supply chain, they already have things. But the cost of infrastructure projects is rising. Equinor, you know, they delayed their $12 billion oil and gas development off the coast of Canada, right, because of costs of inflation. So I think it's, you know, we need to ensure that this conversation, and something that I've been very frustrated about, to be honest, is that we keep seeing these reports in the news about inflation and how it's impacting renewable energy. It's not impacting renewable energy. It's impacting infrastructure and every large development there is. And I think we need to stop talking about it in that way. So again, I think it's recognizing the benefits and taking a comprehensive look at what's included in that cost, and two, really acknowledging that this is not a renewable energy problem. This is a larger problem. And then I think like the last piece, and it's, you know, maybe my optimism is really a little bit more of just the resilience here. I just like, listen, big things are hard. And like, they just are. And this is a really big thing that we're creating in the United States that is a massive opportunity. And not only is it an important opportunity, it's absolutely necessary. You know, this is something we must move forward with. Climate change is here and it's real, and we don't have a choice, and we need to be bold and continue to move forward. And I think that's really it at the end of the day. Be brave.
There'll be other costs too if we don't do it, right?
Right,
I mean, you
precisely.
have flooding in Vermont, you have rising sea temperatures in South Florida, you have 100 and how many days in Arizona above 110. Like, this is, if we don't move forward, there's going to be other costs.
Right.
So.
I think we may have time for one more question. We'll go here.
So I'm Julie Ty with the New York League of Conservation Voters, and we haven't heard at all about challenges really on the ground. David and I were lamenting how we had some conversations with the governor's office, for example, in 2020, because South Fork was kind of at a pinch point and needed to move forward. And now we're seeing some challenges in New Jersey, some challenges in Nassau County with how projects are moving forward, like on the ground. So like, nobody's talked about that. It's all like wine and roses and great inflation, and that's fine. It's a very Wall Street conversation. But like for the people out on the ground, there's a lot happening. And so I think it'd be useful for you all to just tell everybody a little bit about some of those experiences and how we can improve this. And second, this will be a short one. So you mentioned the demand issue. Everyone knows that I've been number one, if New Jersey is not going to out offshore wind us. Do you think that New York State committing to increasing their goals to 15 and then to 20 gigawatts would, in fact, as you alluded to, help ensure that the demand is helping to drive the industry growth?
I think David should certainly talk about what you raised with respect to on the ground, but I do want to just, before he answers, just give huge kudos to, first off, Jen Garvey, of course, and also to you, Julie Tai, because I do think you raise a really important point, which is, we've talked about all these things, but there's a whole public process that happens, and all of these things need to be permitted. And they're really hard decisions to be made at the end of the day, and I think it's incredibly important that that organizations like the League of Conservation Voters, like Citizens Campaign for the Environment, and other folks that have really shown up, organized meetings, talk to people about these permitting decisions and how important these projects are, really did, I think, absolutely move the needle and allow the right decisions to be made at a local level. And I just, we'll see what the future of projects look like and where they have their landing cables in the future, but I think it's an incredibly important point that, when we talk about sort of the answer to Carrie's question and we talk about how we're going to be successful, then ensuring that these projects are really community-based and are working with actual people and ensuring that those benefits really hit home so that we can ensure that there is a broad understanding of what's happening here and people are engaged and have the right information going forward could not be more important. And so huge compliments to those of you that have worked really hard to make that happen. So go Julie and Jen.
I would just say from the city's goal perspective, the higher the goal, the more economic development on the ground. So, and that's true whether you're in Brooklyn or Staten Island or Albany. So keep pushing hard.
We'll get your memo support.
All right.
The higher demand I think is needed, but until it translates to real commitments from developers to supply chain, that's where the rubber meets the road. Because there already is an announcement to build a tower factory in New York and to build a tower factory in Maryland and a cable factory in Maryland. And there's a lot of commitments that are out there, but they're not moving forward right now because all the projects are kind of on pause except for Ørsted's 3 or 4 projects. And I'm not saying that it's been really hard for us too to keep these first projects alive and keep them going. But back to the on the ground part, I think it's a really good point. We haven't talked about that. If you follow me on Twitter, and I don't have a huge following, you'll see some pretty unpleasant things actually from people, and it affects me as a person. I'm like, whoa, I am really working my ass off, excuse my language, to try to change the world and make it a better place and bring renewable energy and bring jobs and bring, equity and all this stuff. And then I have this like, David Hardy, fuck off. David Hardy, you're a piece of shit, David Hardy. And I'm like, oh my God. And so there's some angry people out there, really, who really don't understand. Again, sorry for the language, but that is what it says. And so it's pretty, we have a problem, I think. Ørsted, ACP, the American Clean Power Association, has been running a campaign in New Jersey to just try to educate average citizens. Ørsted has spent a lot of our own money also in New Jersey right now and in New York to try to dispel the disinformation. A lot of it is disinformation. A lot of it is funded. If you trace it, it's funded by oil and gas interests, which is really terrible. But they got a little traction with the whale strandings, and it's just turned into complete mess there. I do think that the developers are somewhat culpable. I even blame us. When all this first started happening in New Jersey, we probably were a little slow to respond. We thought it was so crazy. It was so, it was so unbelievable that people would believe this disinformation that we didn't respond right away, and we let it groundswell a little bit. And I can tell you, we will never do that again. We were taking every piece of negative feedback, we're gonna try to address as fast as we can. And I do think people like Jen and others on our team do, and your organization and Win for Win and Fred Zalkman and lots of people out there who have done the groundwork and work to make sure the communities understand, what it means, what's the visual impact, what's the cable, and I can tell you that we're a lot. Again, go back to the cost of offshore wind. These host community benefits agreements are not inexpensive. Like, we are putting a lot of money into towns to help make it an incentive for them to be supportive, and that cost shows up in the price of the offshore wind. But if that's what it takes, then that's what we'll do. We've adjusted, in all of our forward business. Again, this is my bid team here, but in our current bids, we put a big reserve in to just make sure that we can spend the money to help the towns, understand and support their local needs and things. So it's a real issue, Julie. Thanks for bringing that up. I do think that we have work to do as a community to try to help people see the pros and cons. I think there are definitely some people who are just, they hate Biden. Biden's for offshore wind, so they hate offshore wind, and they're just irrational. But there's also some people who've been misinformed and watching too much Fox News or whatever. So
I'm just going to jump in and give a little shout out to the team at EDC. A bunch of them are sitting in the back because most of this happened before I got there, so I had nothing to do with it. But their on the ground work in places like in Sunset Park and on the West Shore of Staten Island has just been remarkable at kind of getting the buy-in at the local level, and that means a lot of hard work and engagement and workforce development and training and education. We just ran an education program this summer on Staten Island called the Summer of Offshore Wind, just to bring families and kids into the conversation. We had little fun wind turbines made of foam, but all part of an education process to get people ready to embrace the industry. So big shout out to them.
I hate to jump in here because it's clear we could go on with many questions. The insights, the concerns, the optimism, the expertise from this panel has been extraordinary. Can we have a hand for them, please? I just want to thank our partners again for their support. OEP could not do this without them, without your support, many of whom are here. Particular thanks to our co-hosts today, Ørsted and Morgan Lewis. Thank you to Jim Tynan for your opening remarks, to our moderator, Lyndie Hice-Dunton, who did such a fantastic job. And then finally, what a fantastic panel. David Hardy, the industry is fortunate to have such an outstanding leader spearheading Ørsted's extensive investment throughout the clean energy world in the United States. Andrew Kimball, who I was privileged to serve on the Coro board with, and who New York is privileged and fortunate to have as one of the leaders in public service and economic development in this area. And finally, Amanda took her birthday time to be here with us today.
All right.
29 again.
We're not going to sing, but
I think a condition of me agreeing that you weren't going to say that.
on three, I want to hear 1, 2, 3, happy birthday. 1, 2, 3, happy birthday, Amanda. All right, well, thanks to all of you for taking your time to be with us today. Have a great rest of the summer. We have a very ambitious program being put together for the fall. We hope to see many of you there. And thanks again for taking your time. Have a great rest of the summer. Thank you.
Nicely done.